Hello, today I'm going to talk about Sydney then and now and Melbourne then and now and Australia generally, because I photographed these two books. We'll start with Waltzing Matilda. Waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. His news may be heard as you pass by that billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Well, that was about a guy who was an itinerant worker, and he stole a sheep and he was caught by the owner of the land. He fetched the police, and the police turned up, and the itinerant worker jumped into a stream, a billabong, and drowned himself rather than be caught by the police. This idea of sort of like escaping justice, standing against authority, not giving a fuck about what's happening to you and what other people think, is something that runs like a theme through Australia, and it's something I quite admire in a way. I mean, the other obvious villain who is also celebrated in Australia is Ned Kelly, and we'll be looking at him in a minute. But first, let's take a look at these books here. Where did Australia start? Well, it started really when Captain Cook turned up at Botany Bay and thought it was a rather good place, and later on it was used, not much later on, to transport people who had broken the law in Britain, and they were sent off to Australia and spent the rest of their lives there in most cases. And the place that started was, of course, Sydney, what is now called Sydney. And this is an area where that I first photographed, the Circular Quay, which is right in the centre of Sydney, overlooking the magnificent Sydney Harbour. Here it is. That's Sydney Harbour back in 1900 with a ship at bay, and these buildings in the background, these were built as the first stores to house food and things for the prisoners who arrived on the first fleet. And you can see here, when I photographed it a few years ago, they're still there in the background, there on the top left. But the funny thing is about this Circular Quay, you can't see it here, you might see a bit down here at the bottom, set in stone. In the stones there are the names of all the famous Australians we've heard about. The strange thing is that most of them made their fame outside Australia, and so they're celebrated for having left Australia and become famous, which is a bit odd. Escaping Australia or staying there is there's a link there between what we saw of those of where the first fleet turned up with people abroad who couldn't escape, who were prisoners, and those who, to become successful, did escape. And I think there's a psychological link there between the two, although it hasn't really been pointed up. And that part of Sydney is absolutely fascinating, because on the rocks it's called. In fact, why don't we have a look at some of the so-called rocks cut into the rock, because that has a real sort of feel of the past to it, and it should, because it's the oldest part of European Australia. Here it is, these rocks, you can see they're called the rocks for obvious reasons, cut in, and that's where all the stores were and where the first fleet provisioned itself, and it's still there like that, and it has that sort of like a real character to it, unlike anywhere else in any city in Australia as far as I know. The other person who we mentioned, apart from the chap in the billabong who jumped in there, is of course Ned Kelly, he with the big helmet on, painted by Sidney Nolan. Let's look at him. It was 1885 is a year I remember so well, when they drove old Brad into a early grave and sent my mother to jail. Now I don't know what's right or wrong, but they hung Christ on nails. But with 6 kids at home and 2 still on my breast, they couldn't even give her bail. Oh Ned, you're better off dead, you get no peace of mind. The tracks a trail and they're hard on your tail before they're gonna hang you high. Well, they did catch him and hang him high, and in fact I've been to where Ned Kelly's shack is outside Melbourne, and it's sort of preserved and you can walk around it and that sort of thing. But of course he was caught and he was arraigned in Melbourne and he was hanged there. But Melbourne itself is an interesting city. It was very much minor. It was built later than Sydney to start in the 1830s, whereas this is the end of the 18th century Sydney. But it was from about 1840, 1850 onwards, Melbourne began to overtake Sydney as the most important city in Australia, and it stayed that way for over 100 years. Why was that? Well, in the mid-1850s, gold was discovered outside Melbourne, and it became known as a magnet for the whole world, and it became known as Marvellous Melbourne. And also I think, and then it was built up very much, and today, of course, it's called one of the most livable cities in the world, if not the most livable. And I can see why when you go there. Beautiful city. And but let's just have a look at some of the things in Melbourne as well. It was laid out on a plans basis, and here we can see there what they did in Melbourne here. This was the Victoria, the state of Victoria. This was the Parliament building, but it became the Parliament building on the capital of the whole of Australia, and was for many years. There it is today, until Canberra was built, because they couldn't have either Melbourne or Sydney as the capital because they're rivals. So between the two, they built Canberra. But that building is still there. The other amazing building, well, there are lots of amazing buildings, but another one is this one here, which the Anzac Memorial, a shrine of remembrance, which was marks the First World War and the Australians and the New Zealanders' involvement in that and the bravery there. And this is one of the largest war memorials you could see anywhere, and the most impressive, far bigger than anything you would see in Sydney. They have their own, but this is, and there it is today. Extraordinary building. Absolutely amazing. And possibly the most strange thing in Melbourne is this. Captain Cook's cottage. Now you might well ask, what has Captain Cook got to do with Melbourne? After all, he landed in what is now Sydney, Botany Bay, and I mean Melbourne didn't exist then, so why was it taken there? Well, it was taken down brick by brick and moved there in the 30s and rebuilt in their park, and there it is today. Captain Cook's childhood home from Yorkshire. Brick by brick it was brought. So why was it brought to Melbourne of all places? Well, the reason was that Melbourne was by that time the most important city in Australia. In fact, in the 1956, I think it was, they had the Olympic Games there. And I think it was something to do with the fact that Australia bigged it up because it didn't have any connection with the origins of white Australia, which is where the people who had been transported as prisoners were taken, which was Sydney. It didn't have that at all. Well, I'd rather die like Donahue, that bushranger so brave, than be taken by the government and forced to walk in chains. Well, I'd rather fight with all my might while I have eyes to see. Well, I'd rather die 10,000 times than hang from a gallows tree. Oh, dead, you're better off dead, you get no peace of mind. The tracks a trail and they're hard on your tail before they're gonna hang you high.
Sydney would get its own back, and the getting its own back started with the building of the bridge there, the harbour bridge, which opened in the early 30s. And I think that gave the city a visual focus, which Melbourne, however how beautiful it is, doesn't possess in the way that icon does show you where to look, and it does encompass the Sydney Harbour. But it wasn't just that, so we'll just have a look at another picture here and see what we've got here. There you can see we've got the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Huge structure. And there it is today, unchanged. Now you can walk across the top and have tours walking across the top. You have to be tied up so you don't blown off, but you can do that. But the thing that I think brought the city to prominence over Melbourne visually more than anything else was the construction of this. In 1973 it was opened, which is the Sydney Opera House. And the reason for that was not just because that's what it was like before. Nothing really. And then to this, you see. But it wasn't just that did it. It seemed to complete the picture, because it seems to me, I mean, there's an old picture of Sydney at the time when Melbourne was in the ascendancy. But then look at it now. And apart from the skyscrapers, which both the cities have, of course, what has happened? Well, what has happened is that on the right you've got the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and on the left you've got the Opera House. And what they do, they provide a frame, almost like a picture frame, for the city of Sydney itself. And those two images hold together this picture frame of Sydney as the most important city in Australia and one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I did write a letter and I sealed it with my hand. I tried to tell about a stringy boggy creek. I tried to make them understand, oh, that I didn't want to kill Kennedy or cause his blood to run. Well, he alone could have saved his life by throwing down his gun. Oh, Ned, you're better off dead. You get no peace of mind. A track's a trail and the heart on your tail before you're gonna hang you high. Oh, Ned, you're better off dead. You get no peace of mind. A track's a trail and the heart on your tail before they're gonna hang you high. All these architectural things I've photographed, there's something I haven't mentioned, because all these were built by white people, you say for white people, by the people who invaded either deliberately or were taken there against their own will. And I haven't mentioned, of course, the first peoples of Australia, what used to be called the Aborigines. And that is something which is, I don't know, it's almost like something that's the ghost of Australia. It's a sort of something not swept under the carpet, but it's always there. The fact that this country was stolen, the whole of the Australian continent was stolen and the islands around it. And you thought, well, why isn't there some sort of building or something to that? Well, of course, there's a museum, no original museum, and there's other things, Uluru in the centre of Australia, but there's nothing actually that's sort of compensation, visual compensation. And I wondered if there could be something, I mean, Captain Cook's cottage is hardly the sort of thing that you could say was really relevant not only to Melbourne, but not relevant to the First Peoples. And then I came across something when I was photographing and writing London Then and Now several years later, which we'll talk about on another of these little things. And there's this place. Here's London Then and Now. But I finish with this right at the end. And it's a place that was in the East End of London, in the Mile End Road. This sort of undistinguished looking place. Well, this actually was Captain Cook's house, and it was from here that he left for Australia and discovered Botany Bay, from this actual house. Sadly, it was demolished in 1958. Very sad that was. And now, today, it's just that, with a sort of rough car park behind, with a plaque on the wall and a sort of little mini supermarket next to it. Very run down. And what I would suggest is that if the whole thing was dismantled, I don't know, I think the First Peoples could see what a wreck it has caused for them, and they could take it away and do with it what they would like. Just a thought. Because, you know, you can't exorcise ghosts. They'll always be there. It's best to recognise them, celebrate them even.
Up jumped a spikeman, swam in the billabong. You'll never take me alive, said he, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Now I should say, pass the Nobby's beer nuts.